I think you can use data to drive you wherever you want it to be if you pull from the right stuff. You know what I mean? So it is always important to understand what it is you're looking at.
This is the Wildfire Lessons Podcast. Our goal is to promote learning by revealing the complexity and risk in the wildland fire environment. We share the lessons. The learning that follows is up to you. Hi, I'm Kelly Woods, Director of the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. On today's episode of the podcast, Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center analyst Travis Dotson and I talk about some of the lessons we saw in learning reviews and reports in 2023. Travis highlights some themes and shares his unique insights on data. We reference both the annual incident review summary and our latest issue of Two More Chains, which feature many of the lessons we discuss and provide links to the source material. These documents can be found on our website, lessons.wildfire.gov. I hope you hear something that resonates with you and motivates you to do some active learning. Hey, Travis, you ready to talk about lessons from 2023?
Absolutely. I love talking about lessons, and this is a time of year that try and get this stuff out there. So yeah, absolutely. I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Awesome. We had some good ones last year. So I think this has been a fun episode. I always look forward to it. You have great insights, and it's fun to hear the stories and have the conversation. So cool. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think the easiest thing is go right down the incident review summary. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you could pull it up and walk through it as we're talking, since we'll just kind of follow it. And the incident review summary is something we put out every year. This year we got it out, I think, in early February, first week of February, and it's 10 pages of, the previous year's lessons condensed into, obviously it's not every single report. So yeah, we'll just start right in where it starts, which is what everybody's always most interested in, I feel like.
Well, let's say real quick too, if people want to download it, it's go to lessons.wildfire.gov, and across the top, go to the products section and down to the annual incident review summary right there off the top toolbar.
Yeah, and you can get all of the previous ones too, and those in most cases those lessons don't, it's not like they quit being useful. Look at this year's for sure. There's a thing about recency, but some of those older ones have some pretty solid stuff in them too.
I think that's a great point, because they're all filed there, so people can get in and look at what were we talking about 5 years ago, and odds are pretty darn good that there's going to be some really useful stuff that, check it out, and you don't have to just go with this year's. But, another reminder that you work really hard on getting some good discussion questions in there as well. So you can, look at any of those to get access to the lessons, but also discussion question ideas. So it's really cool.
Yeah, it's designed to be a useful tool for the folks that are, obviously just for anybody, but if you're putting on a refresher or a specific class that has to do with, maybe it's falling or firing operations or something like that, you will be able to find a discussion item in some of those that relate to what you're doing. And it's not quite curriculum, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, starting on the first page there. Well, the first content page there. Fatalities?
Yes. So total number of fatalities in 2023 was 13. That's down quite a bit from last year. We had 25 last year. And so it was, it's always a hard thing to talk about, because, when we start talking about it in numbers, I remember fairly early when in my position as an analyst, I really struggled with this, and I wrote an article called "People, Not Numbers," and this whole thing, there's the whole gist of it, right? It's people, not numbers. And so I just always want to throw that out there and make acknowledgement of, that. And when we're talking about these things that, I don't want to be insensitive about it. And yet there is utility in talking about some of the things that are most easily described in terms of numbers. And so that's just something that's on my mind almost every time I need to talk about these things. But 13 fatalities this year compared to 25 last year. Quite a drop. It's still well within the range of normal. We see that number fluctuate, and it's funny. You'll hear people say, "Well, the average is 17.6 or 18.2 or something." You know what I mean? Like, and the reality is that number is different based on how many years you look at and what years you look at. And so the numbers that we have in here are based on a 10-year time frame, the previous 10 years. And that's why that number and the line, all of that stuff changes. And when I would always advise people, when somebody says the number is ... understand that, like, well, if you take an average of 36 years, it's different than the average of the last 10 years. And if you take 15 years, like, those numbers are going to be different. But it is always somewhere around 16, 17, 18. That's typically where the average floats. And so the average for the past 10 years, I think it's 15.5. And that's where people will see a different number than what you'll see published elsewhere. But the types of, I'll get to that line, that trend line, but the types of incidents that resulted in fatalities this year were ones that we see on a regular basis: vehicle accidents. One thing to note on the vehicle accidents is 2 of them were like typical vehicles. Like, one was a pickup truck, and another one I think was actually a POV of people heading to a brush fire. But 2 of them were one was an ATV and one was a UTV, and I think we'll come back to that later. But vehicle accidents is something that we see fatalities with just about every year. Medical, same thing. Aviation, those 3 fatalities was the result of one event, right? A helicopter went down on a fire in California.
It was the mid-air, correct?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, the mid-air. 2 helicopters, one was able to make it to the ground without serious injury, and the other one wasn't.
Yeah, and all of those 3 fatalities that we have listed were from that one event. So great. I'm glad you caught that. And then we had a single hit by tree fatality, and then one that we don't see real often, which was where they were on scene and a power line fell and resulted in a fatality. So that was the one kind of thing that we don't see that often in terms of cause. And man, the environment we work in has got a lot of variables.
Yeah. So just talking about that, the 10-year trend line there, it's interesting, you and I were talking about this. If we listen here real quick to last year's episode of The Lessons, where we were talking about the trend line, you had a statement about what we might see this year. And so let's just listen to that real quick. And then I want you to talk about what you said and what played out. So let's listen to it now.
All right. When I record that 10-year fatality, 2013 won't be in there.
Which of course, means 2013, that number includes the Yarnell Hill fire there.
Exactly, right. Yeah. So we'll see what it looks like. We don't know exactly what 2023 is going to look like. We know it's not going to be 0.
Yeah.
Because we've had 5 fatalities already recorded this year.
Yeah.
So yeah, that trend line is what I'm envisioning, having it right now. It looks level, right, with an average at 17.7, and I think that next year, without the influence of Yarnell in that little picture, that data set, it might look different. But that's just an interesting thing to note. What I can envision is that trend line being a little bit more steep, kind of climbing up, and having people go, "Oh my gosh, look at this, crazy trend of where there's more and more firefighters dying every year," and I think that might be true for that 10-year time period. But as with anything, you zoom out a little bit, and it gives you a different perspective.
Okay, Travis, what do you have to say about your prediction there, your discussion there, and how things played out in 2023?
Yeah, hearing that, it's like, well, yeah, I guess it happened. In terms of, and I mean, it's not like, oh, that's super hard to predict. You can see that coming when you're in the numbers all the time. But I think the reaction piece is the part that I don't know for sure that somebody's going to say, hey, look at that, see, obviously we're having more and more fatalities every year. The trend line's straight going up. I don't know if people are going to say that, because you kind of have to be paying attention to see that. But I have definitely heard people comment on the trend line that's going up. And they're not wrong, because you look at that trend line and you go, yeah, it's clearly going up, which it is for, again, this chunk of time that we looked at, the previous 10 years. And just last year it looked so differently. It looked so different. And that's just what happens when you have these spikes. There's years where you're going to have really high numbers and really low numbers. And that as soon as you get out of that influence, it's just curious to change, because last year it was just about level. And then you look at it now and it makes it seem like, if you're just looking at the previous, this graph, it looks like there's a very obvious upward trend. But if you zoom way out, I sent you the graph of 36 years of fatality data, and that line's almost level. It is up, just it has a clearly notable trend up, but it's not steep like this one. So it's like anything, you gotta take into account the context. Sometimes zooming out is helpful, and sometimes maybe what we do want to look at is just the previous 10 years or 5 years. I think I looked in entrapments. There was a segment where I just looked at the past 5 years for a very specific thing. We'll talk about it later, but
I think the point that's really, and this is why I think it's great that you brought this up last year and we're talking about it. The point is to understand what it is you're looking at, mm-hmm. right? With that context, because, I think data is important and it's super valuable. And we're certainly in a point now where we're talking about data, in a lot of the committees and work that we do, it's all about the data driving things. And I think you can use data to drive you wherever you want it to be if you pull from the right stuff. You know what I mean? So it is always important to understand what it is you're looking at. So I appreciate that perspective. And to me, you look at last year we had 25 fatalities. This year we had 13, and the trend line's going up. It's just like trying to understand it and dig in. So I think it's great that you've given us some context for it.
Yeah, and it's always helpful to say, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean to you? You know what I mean? Because that's why there's those discussion questions in the guide. Is like, hey, neat, there's a graph. What is it? What does it mean? What are you going to go out there and do or not do with this information or some other piece of information? And yeah, there's all kinds of quotes about torturing numbers until they give you what you want, and you know what I mean. It's like that's they all come from a real place. And so yeah, like you said, ask questions, keep asking questions, have the dialogue, and then and then know what it means to you.
I think it's also important to note these are fatalities affiliated with wildland fire activities, right? I mean, that should be kind of a given. We probably say that every year, but it is important for people to realize that it's anyone responding to operating on, wildland fire. It's not feds. It's not feds and state. It's really everyone. Comprehensive glance at that.
Absolutely. In the U.S.
In the U.S., yeah.
Because this happened to be a year where there were wildland fire fatalities in Canada, and those are not reflected in our data here.
Yeah.
So, again, it's just knowing what's included.
Yeah.
And what it means. But yeah, it's not just federal. It's, that's where it's like people go, wait a minute, a privately owned vehicle is, it was some folks from a volunteer department that were responding, to
a wildland fire.
To a wildland fire. And, that's in the realm of wildland fire response.
Yeah, they're trained responders. That's what they do. Yeah. Should we move on to the UTV topic? It's a topic we've been hitting pretty hard at the Lessons Learned Center for good reason.
Yeah. It's I felt like this year was kind of I don't know. There's times when I feel like I get on a kick, and it's not just a kick. It's just there's something that is revealed based on the fact that we're looking at all this stuff. And I feel like there's times when, and I feel like UTVs is one of those where I'm like, hey, UTV, we need to look at this. I'm trying to make some noise about it. And fair enough when people are just like, geez, why do we got to hear about that all the time? And it's because it's coming from someplace. And this happened to be a year where it was like, man, some stuff occurred that was like, yeah, it's serious.
I think people love, of course, I'm fully, immersed in it all, but I think people love when you make noise or we make noise. Like, hey, here's what we're seeing. Here's what we're thinking. We read the reports. You have such vast knowledge on what has occurred over the, since you're 15 years plus at the Lessons Learned Center. Like, there's so much value in that. So I just want to say thank you for making noise.
Yeah. Maybe it's the noise that I make sometimes that people get annoyed by, but at least that's what my daughter says. But yeah, like UTVs were, they were a thing this year. There was quite a few instances of a variety of things, right? It's not like we're saying, hey, it's just the UTV fires. That was a thing that we've kind of made noise about in the past was UTVs catching fire for any number of reasons. And we had 4 of those this year. But we
a couple of tree strikes.
Yeah.
That was an odd one to see those tree strikes. I think one was down on the Oconee or someplace like that, National Forest, and one was in Texas, I believe. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, one of them, they, like the one early on in the year, I remember they stopped to look at the hazard tree, and then the tree fell. And what I remember about that is there was somebody seatbelted in the UTV when it started to fall, and they had to unbuckle and scramble and get out of it before it, and luckily they did. That's pretty gnarly.
And it was a huge, the picture is pretty crazy of that in the report. So,
it's a tree right on top of a UTV and it is destroyed.
Yeah.
It would have been a super bad deal if that firefighter would have not gotten out of there.
And then the one in Texas, I think it was the Sherwood Creek or something like that, tree strike. That was an interesting one too, with some really, I thought, great lessons on that one. Some lessons about visibility at night of equipment, which we may talk about here a bit later, but can you see what's happening around you, that, where other people are engaged? And then the use of some specialized equipment to knock, take down trees that doesn't get used a lot. How much training is there? How much discussion goes into the safety prior to using it? I think that's a really well done report with some good lessons.
Absolutely. And it was night ops, and they had to dozer and, you know, they were using the UTV to scout out ahead. And yeah, the tree went over and nailed that, knocked the UTV over. But yeah, I agree. There's some great stuff in there. It'd be a really good one to check out. And the nexus, you know, about another thing that we've made noise about because of actual events is just visibility, right, at night. Like for people, for equipment, it's just, you know, visibility is a big deal, and we'll get to that in the lessons from the learners section. But yeah, there's some, you know, like there's great tools these days for that, and we'll tie into that a little bit later. But UTV fires continue to happen, and we have a data points about that. It'd be a good one to check out. And really, the message I'm pushing this year is about inspections in general for UTVs. I think it's possible that UTVs they don't quite get treated as vehicles. You know how you know, you go out to the engine every morning and you do a walk around and you do, you know what I mean, you do a preventative maintenance check every morning just as protocol. And I'm not certain that UTVs get that kind of attention all the time.
Seems like one of the things, and we may have talked about this a little bit with data points, but there's less direct ownership on those on UTVs. Sometimes, like, there's a crew. Communal. Yeah, communal. So there's a crew rig, and this is your job to do the PM check. And sometimes those preventative maintenance checks don't get done on a piece of equipment like that, right? Yeah, I think that's a great thing. Yeah, great thing to push. And you know, I think another thing is of course, the fire extinguisher is huge. And when you look at the Little Mesa fire from Colorado, that report, you know, they had a fire extinguisher, but it wasn't big enough to put out the fire. So yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting one of those UTV reports too.
Yeah. And so, you know, if this is as far as you get in the podcast and you have, you know, there's a UTV on your unit somewhere, start asking around like, hey, are we doing checks? Are we looking at welds? You know what I mean? Because we had several instances of welds coming apart and that causing problems. Obviously, some of them fires because it was in the exhaust system. Wiring problems that started fires that, you know, again, are more likely to get caught with regular inspections. And same thing, you know, just look, is there a fire extinguisher? Is it, has it been inspected lately? Does the little arrow, is it in the green? You know, like just stuff that gets caught with regular inspections. That's, you know, man, if you could walk away from this with improving UTV inspections on your home unit, man, that's a win right there. The one thing I will, in the discussion questions of that section, we ask, hey, what are the benefits that UTVs provide? Because what I don't want to happen is that we get so focused on, you know, some of these unintended outcomes that we start to view UTVs only as a way that bad things happen. Because, man, I remember before we were using UTVs, and I think UTVs mitigate so many things for us.
Yes, great tool, right? Great tool.
Oh man, it's amazing. I think we like heat-related illness, like mitigations for heat-related illness, and even just by not hiking, you know, that first, we all know that's some of the cool research that's been done about that initial hike that elevates your core body temperature. Like in certain environments, it's really hard to recover from that. So, and people are using UTVs to mitigate that. And then they're also saying, hey, and then let's have some ice and let's have enough water and let's have, you know what I mean? Like that. UTVs
hauling cargo and
all of that stuff and carrying less weight because, you know, the UTV can come and pick up all the hose instead of us carrying, you know, whatever it is, all the way out. Like, that's great. It's important to use these tools to mitigate that risk.
I think that's such a great point because, the reaction, it's like we talked about a minute ago, we can use data to drive us one way or the other. And if we start going, whoa, we've had way more UTV incidents. Well, there's reasons for that. We also have way more UTVs, and let's look at it and let's, own it as something we need to study and try and understand where there are accidents, how we're using them. And address that, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Absolutely, and we don't have a real like flashy way to record and show on a graph the benefits. You know what I mean? It's not like we can say, "Oh, UTVs prevented this many heat-related illness," or this. You know what I mean? This many, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's like asking a fire prevention officer, how many fires did you prevent today?
Totally, and so, I think it's just real key to be thinking of that. And then thinking, taking that out there to the fire ground or the project area and thinking about risk versus benefit and how can we use this tool to mitigate some of the risk and what are the things that happen like hey, do we have a fire extinguisher, did we do a walk around, did we like look at the welds and all of that stuff and just think of them in terms of risk management.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, man, that UTV drum, and I've been beating on that for a while. Let's see, burn injuries. Should we talk about burn injuries?
Yeah, definitely. A couple of interesting ones on that too. Just thinking about the Alaska pump, the Mark III pump. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, and it happens every so often that we get these scenarios where someone is injured by heated water, steam, you know what I mean, that kind of stuff from pumping, whether it's the back of the engine or in this case a Mark III pump, and it's not regular. It's not like we see them all the time, but when I look back, it's like, it happens periodically. And it's another one of those things that it's easy to forget the danger that's involved and sometimes like the skill that's required to actually run a pump. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like I'm sure for a lot of us, it was like, oh, my time as a pump operator was because I was doing my firefighter 1 task book. And when the crew was out working, I sat by the pump, all day, and they said, turn it on, turn it off. And like, that was the extent of my pump operator.
I was never a good pumper operator because, as you know, I'm very social. And for me to sit by a noisy pump all day was like, I was a mess when I've got to be around people again at the end of the shift. So I hardly had to do it because it wasn't good for my mental health.
Yeah. It's, and I think that scenario where the way that we use pumps is just it's very likely for one of us to be put in a situation where okay, go run the pump, and maybe we had a class in it, and maybe that class was good, or maybe that class was recently, maybe it was a long time ago. And there's some real specific things that they go over in this report that if you want to look more into it, I should definitely go read this report. And what ended up happening is the pressure building up actually blew one of the intake off, right, and that hot water just went right onto the operator because he could tell something was wrong. So he was over kind of straddling, trying to figure out how to do it. And he actually had a recirculation line. It just, the way it was set up, there was pressure pushing back onto that thing, and it blew that hose right off. And that scalded his leg pretty bad.
Another thing with this report that's worth mentioning is there's also a video that they did that accompanies the report that the IMT talks about their response. And there's an interview with some folks from the agency. And so you can kind of get, both things, the written report and check out the video with there's a link in the report to it. So
yeah, and it's one of those reports that reaches a whole bunch of different levels, because there's some real mechanical, like, like I was just talking about, like, man,
hydraulic
yeah,
stuff.
all of that stuff. There's a real operational context, to some of those lessons. And then it goes up from there. And some IMT members, you should definitely go read this, because there's this whole dilemma of like, we kind of want to get back to work. And what does light duty mean? If somebody's released to light duty, like, what do you do with that? Especially if they're assigned to a crew and the crew's still there and they want to work, but they've got a burn injury that needs to be kind of kept clean. You know what I mean? There's some cultural things in there. I mean, like wildland fire culture. And then there's also just like straight up incident management things to think about. And so I really commend that group and that IMT for pursuing this and putting that report out there, because there's lessons for lots of people in that.
Lots of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important, because I think a lot of times people think that the lessons that we house and share are pretty tactical, and definitely they're not. And this is a good example of it hitting a really broad audience. So.
Absolutely. Let's see. And then we had, we continue to have these drip torch leg injuries. We're seeing them this year again. We saw them last year, and I looked back at the first time that we made noise about this, and it was 10 years ago that we put out an RLS that had a compilation of like, hey, drip torches and leg injuries, that we see them more often than you might think, and it continues to happen. There's certain scenarios that we see repeated vines and briars in the southeast. Like, it makes sense. You get caught up in that stuff, and as you're trying to get out, and that, don't forget that drip torch is flinging fire around just like it's designed to do. Yeah. And sometimes that fire gets on you, and there's some real tactical lessons in there about, okay, try to, when you get hung up, like, slowing down and thinking about the tip of that torch and trying to put it out. I can see how sometimes that would be hard.
I think another thing that's, we've seen this in a lot of burn injury reports, but I don't know that we've ever called it out, but in the Harvey prescribed fire drip torch burn injury report that we're talking about from last year is a link to that video that NTDP, the National Technology Development Program, put out about how to put out a fire on your clothing. Because, since you just had a bunch of students come to the fire department there today to learn about fire, and stop, drop, and roll is so beat into our heads, right, from the time we're little. But that's not the best method if you have fuel on your Nomex and you're trying to put it out. So I would encourage folks to, look up that Harvey prescribed fire report, and then get a link to the video about the best way to put those kind of clothing fires out.
Yeah, absolutely. That, because it's complicated, because you've got that fuel. It's usually combined. It's usually combined with fuel soaked into your pants, because those things leak. Like, it's just, that's what they do. And we're filling torches and, out of fibers, and it's just like, that stuff gets all over the place. And but yeah, that the way to put the fire out, that video is great, because it talks about the best way to do it. And it's like, drop your pants,
man.
Or put water on it. Like, it's
put water on it, drop your pants, get the fire out, rather than stop, drop, and roll, or try and, pat it down with your gloves, and the stuff that would be more intuitive.
Exactly. And I understand it's hard to keep that in mind, when your leg's on fire.
Yeah, exactly. But if you've watched the video, read these reports, if your pants catch on fire with fuel on them, you're going to maybe think about it, right? If you've never watched it, you've never read it, you're certainly going to be a little bit panicked, but you're probably going to stop, drop, and roll, or try and pat it out. And both of those can actually make it worse.
Absolutely. And socks matter. We've got a whole
And socks matter.
blog
Yep.
post about that. Like, you know, having tall, natural fiber socks
Makes a difference.
Makes a difference.
It's always interesting when we see a calf burn injury or something like that. You can tell exactly where the socks were, without fail.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so, yeah, if burning's something that you do a lot of, carrying that torch around, these are good things to talk about and share with people, because it's always a regular part of our burn injury things every year. I think that's about everything on the burn injuries, unless you had anything else.
No, I just tell people, that Ida fire burn injury with the blower that blew up. Like there's some interesting stuff in there. So people should hit some of those links or go to our incident review database and look up burn injuries 2023 and see what they find.
Yeah. And it's always good to look in whatever your organization's guidance is around burn injuries in general.
Understand the protocol, the burn injury protocol. There's some lessons about that for folks, to understand what it is, how to best use it, how to best advocate for somebody who has a burn injury when you're not sure, what degree or what, if they need a burn center consult or something like that. Like, how can you best advocate, or what questions should you be asking? So there's a lot of good stuff in the reports, and really from the last few years, these discussions have been pretty robust.
Yeah.
So.
And there was a change in the federal burn protocol last year. And so, if you're a federal person, doesn't hurt to look at that red book, and they have a flow chart that's different than it was in the past, and understand it ahead of time. And
yeah, for sure.
The other thing I always plug on burn injuries is don't forget, like when you're filling torches or, all of that stuff, like that is flammable liquid that we get so used to dealing with it. And then we go and like light stuff on fire, and half the time we're covered in drip mix, and then we go play with fire or saw mix, whatever. It's just like, it's crazy how comfortable, when I think about it, how comfortable we are around with just fuel in general, and fire, the combination of them.
Well, and this is obviously a topic of another episode of our podcast that we're the presumptive illness and firefighter exposure, right? Like the firefighter exposure when we're sitting there with fuel-soaked clothing on for how long, just having it right on your skin. And yeah, like I said, another topic, but an important topic related to our comfort level with fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. What was next?
Chainsaw cuts and trees.
Yeah, chainsaw cuts and hit by trees. I put those together on one page this year. The big thing last year we were talking about, which was, hey, the chainsaw cuts. Again, this was last year. More of the cuts occurred to swampers than to sawyers last year, and this year we had 0 reports sent to us of swampers getting cut. So if I was not good at my job, I would say, see, we were so effective. We put all the word out last year, and then nobody got cut. No swampers got cut because we told them don't get cut and be real careful, and that's why it happened.
If only it was that easy.
Yeah. It doesn't actually work that way. I wish I had that much influence, but we're all glad that I don't. But yeah, that was a noticeable difference, and the number of chainsaw cuts in general was down from last year, which is always a relief, because man, chainsaw cuts are gnarly. Another thing that we get real comfortable around, like it's a spinning chain with blades, running around. We're just like real comfortable around it. And then the hit by trees. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I thought that the report that stands out to me just thinking here is that Anvil Fire chainsaw cut. The sawyer was walking in thick brush and fell, and their hand came in contact with the moving chain. And I think that's a really well written report. And the pictures certainly speaks pretty loudly, but I think that's a report for people to think about. I think about back in the days when I used to run a chainsaw, which I don't do at all anymore, but just I'd be moving, all the time, and that chain would be going, and so easy to fall. That was one that I went, ooh, that could easily have been me at some point in time.
And, I do remember, because there is some crossover on the comfort and I do remember several years ago, we had a drip torch burn injury report from a crew, and the crew's lesson was, we should think of drip torches and that tip, that part that's on fire, the same way that we treat chainsaws, right? Because you're not, you know what I mean? Like, it's not okay to just be, waving that chainsaw around while it's, running. It looks odd if you're just, like moving around, and you're really cautious about getting it near you. Whereas, sometimes we don't have that same immediate kind of caution around the tip of the drip torch. But you can also, it's just dangerous. Like, fire can burn you and a chainsaw can cut you. And so anytime you're close and you're moving around with that thing, like, that's part of the risk we deal with on a regular basis. But I agree with you that report is a good one for that kind of like, oh yeah, I could tighten up on that. The hit by tree instances, we continue to have the scenario where half of them occur during tree felling ops and half of them occur when no tree was being felled. Trees fall down in the woods, and we spend a lot of time in the woods. And so that's always a thing that I point out, that just because it says hit by tree doesn't mean that somebody was falling a tree and it went wrong. And then the other thing about at least 2 instances where the sawyers were struck after the tree hit the ground, like the tree went, and then it was something about the tree hitting the ground, or a branch that came off, resulted in them getting hit by a piece of the tree after it hits the ground, which is not the typical thing we think of when we think of getting hit by a tree. And sawyers aren't the only ones that get struck. We had 2 instances of a swamper getting hit. So yeah, those are all real good. If you're on a saw team or you run a saw or whatever, like, again, look at those specific reports. Most people like to, I don't know, it's just chainsaws are a thing that firefighters like to, talk about. So read those reports and talk about chainsaw stuff with whoever it is you've got with. All right. Entrapments. What did we say about entrapments? Initial attack, 9 during initial attack. Initial attack engine operations, and 2 during initial attack dozer operations, and then 1 during UTV ops. And I think in the 2 more chains that we have, this real recent one, we've got some additional numbers in there that weren't in the review summary. And that's where I looked at just the most recent 5 years, the 2019 to 2023, and I did that just because I was like, I wonder about these numbers. And in the past 5 years, 80% of our engine entrapments occurred during initial attack, which makes sense.
Says something, right? It says something, though. Like, I mean, it does totally make sense. But it tells you when you're trying to do entrapment avoidance, like, where do you want to focus? What do you want to talk about, right?
And that, it's just, man, initial attack in a thing that's moving, trying to attack another thing that's moving. Like,
it would be interesting to overlay if somebody's doing initial attack and scouting, how many of those are scouting an initial attack, right?
Yeah. And we can, I can think of instances where that was the case, that some pretty, I think of the frog fire right away, fatality. But yeah, absolutely. They start layering, right? It's like, okay, if you're doing initial attack with heavy equipment, that's another, lots of things we do involve lots of risk. But man, those are the things that they make me pay attention.
Yeah, I thought that SKU August Lightning Complex, the dozer that was entrapped and deployed the curtains. That's I think a well done report sent to us by Cal Fire. That's one Absolutely. For folks to read for sure.
Yeah, just couldn't get out and needed to, and pretty amazing that they have an enclosed cab with curtains that are, it's the same concept as a fire shelter, right? It gives you an added layer of protection when it's a last resort. And it happened, and it deployed the curtains and
walked
away. Yeah. Pretty wild. And we all are subject to that notion that like you're going to have time. Like that's the way I always envision it for myself is, I'll have time for this and that. And we get report after report of it's just like, man, it happens fast. So yeah, that was one of them. The other number in Two More Chains, there's the 80%. Again, this is just engine entrapments in the past 5 years. 45% involved an immobilized engine, and immobilized meaning they couldn't move it for some reason. Sometimes it's a mechanical failure. Sometimes it's they got stuck in sand or rocks or, and part of what made me look at that is because we had several of those instances last year and we had several more this year. And we had several of them this year where the actual process of engine protection needed to be utilized. Right. And it's like, when you think about what engine protection is in that instance, like that's kind of a sketchy deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can imagine that, like, even if you've practiced it, or especially if you haven't practiced it, and now like here comes the fire, like that gets hard.
The Morsanya entrapment, couldn't get the hose disconnected, right?
Yeah, if you've got a charged hose, that makes sense. It's hard to disconnect that. And I know people, in the internet chat are going to have all kinds of super simple solutions about, you should always have your sharp Pulaski right there, and you're going to, cut it. And that's why we practice cut and run. And that's the thing is, like, practice it, do it. Get some old hose, and you know what I mean? Like, because like the complications arise when you're doing it. And then we had that other one where they stuck with the engine, and they ended up crawling under it, and that was an immobilized by they just couldn't get it out of neutral, right? It was some sort of electronic failure or something like that, and it's just like, the engine's not it's not moving. And they had to make this really hard decision, which all of these have a really hard decision about stay or go. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes it's clearly not an option. But sometimes, like in this case, they looked around and they said, I think this is kind of as good as it gets. And then they had a plan, and they, used some of the hose line for as long as they could, and but ended up surviving by crawling under the engine as the fire came over them. That's a pretty wild report to read.
For sure.
But that combination, initial attack and being immobilized, makes me want to tell people, hey, if you're eyeing a fire in an engine and you're about to, go cross country, just make a real intentional decision there, right? It's way better if you can do it from inside the black. And it's just like the minute you leave that road, which of course we do, if you get immobilized, it's just, it's a
options run out.
Exactly. And I mean, we've had it where people just like it, they bottomed out, or they, it just things that you're just not always you're not paying attention to because you're fighting fire. So be careful.
Yeah. A topic that I thought we'd discuss today too is the delayed medical attention. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, I'm so glad you caught that, because it's not in the review summary. But we did have some, some pretty wild instances where, somebody's got something going on, whether it's just a cough or a bee sting or a blister, you know what I mean? That you kind of like, it's the kind of thing that I certainly would hesitate to go to the medical tent for.
You might hesitate to even bring it up to your
Yeah,
supervisor, right?
absolutely. Just like, man, a blister? Are you kidding? You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be the person that says, "Hey, I have a blister." But in this case, like, they had a blister and they did just that, and it escalated to the point where they spent days in the hospital.
Yeah, like a week or something, right? Nearly developed sepsis, like really serious.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, the sooner you can catch that stuff, the more options you have, and the later that it's more complicated by then, and that's exactly what happened in this case. And now there was the blister one, and then there was the bee sting one, very similar. Just we're like, and then the next day,
It's just a bee sting.
yeah, just
Wow.
yeah. The next day, like it shows pictures of that finger, and it's like, and at one point they were like, yeah, you might not have that finger after this is done.
Yeah, and I mean the like you said, the pictures in both of those reports are so striking. I remember I called my son over when I opened the blister one. I'm like, dude, you need to look at this picture, because I'm always telling him, like, pay attention to your body. What's happening? You need to know. So I was like, look at that picture, and he's like, Mom, But I'm like, that's a blister. And this person spent a week in the hospital, and like, it's a big deal. But there's a cultural thing there, right? Like, you don't want to be the one that's like slowed down by something, I'm fine kind of thing. And so those are, I would say, if I was still like any kind of a module leader or anything like that, like, talk about that. What's the pulse? If you're the leader, have everybody read that report and talk about, how do you feel about talking about a blister, or what's the culture here on our crew to get help when we need it. There's other reports we've seen where people walk right by medical tents and everything else and just suffer and ultimately suffer some pretty catastrophic consequences.
Yeah, and not checking in, which again, I think I validate that. I think there's reasons why folks are hesitant, right? I don't want to come across like we're blaming folks, because there's definitely a culture around it. But then I think there's complications too, based on who your employer is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a realistic thing, but I want people to understand on all sides of this that we're talking about serious consequences, like death, right? We've had instances where somebody demobes from a fire, and within a day or so, like, died of complications from pneumonia.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, it's serious stuff, and people come really close. We had one from a while back where somebody went all the way to septic shock, and that's scary. That's pretty serious stuff.
And I think there's just like the folks who are drawn to this type of work are we learn to work through discomfort. I mean, it's that kind of like, are you hurt or are you just uncomfortable kind of thing, right? And sometimes it's really hard to know until it gets quite far along.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's a requirement of the job in a lot of ways, right? To be able to work through discomfort.
Yeah, my dad's college wrestling coach used to say to people, are you tough or are you just sort of tough? And I think that really applies in the folks in Wildland Fire pretty well too.
Yeah, and so, but we had in this just this past year, right? 2023, three pretty clear-cut cases of it turning into like scary medical scenarios. I mean, like we talked about, from a blister, that spending a week in the hospital, and almost losing a finger, from a bee sting, and having just like an unclean. I can't remember if it was a wound or what it was, but yeah, it's like pretty potential for pretty bad stuff, and so going and getting the medical attention that you need is important.
Yeah, for sure. That's one that I think it's not as overt as some of the other lessons, right? But
Yeah,
you see it. So, yeah.
and we have access to way more access to like pretty solid medical treatment than we've had in the past. And in general, like, I run into anybody that's staffing that arm of these fires, right? These, whether they're there as an EMT or medical unit leader, or all of those folks, man, they just want to do their job, right? And they're happy to help out. And so, yeah, go see them and take care of yourself. And supervisors, man, be real intentional about the environment that you're creating with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's unhandy to have any kind of an injury, but it's real unhandy to spend a week in the hospital.
Yeah, for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've kind of talked about various themes here, but what are some just other good lessons we saw throughout, the reports that came in 2023?
All right. One that I think we should hit pretty hard is that when you use the medical incident report, that top 3 thing that has the colors associated with it, um, those don't have anything to do with the method that somebody's going to be extracted. You know what I mean? It doesn't. That has to do with how quickly they need to get out of there, right? That's why it says, priority 1, immediate. That has to do with the condition of the person, and we got to get them out as soon as we can, whatever that method might be. And the next one can be delayed, and the other one is it's not emergency transport. But what has happened is there's misconceptions or assumptions that where we mix up things like, oh, they have to, if they need a helicopter to get out of here, then they have to be red, or if they're not red, we can't use a helicopter. An example being, hey, say the crew hike down into some pretty gnarly country, and then somebody sprains an ankle and they just can't walk out. Yet the most efficient way to get them out, there's no urgency in terms of time, but in terms of risk, it actually makes the most sense to use a helicopter to get a green patient out of there. Like, that is possible.
I also think it's possible the opposite is possible, right? You could have a very severe injury that needs immediate medical attention that takes place on the road, and we would never say, well, they can drive, so it's green. So I think when you look at the opposite way, it makes so much sense. But when we start hearing things, which we did in some of the reports that we saw, like if anybody gets hurt down here, it's automatically red. Nobody's even hurt yet. How can we say that, right?
But what they're meaning is it's going to be really hard to get somebody out of here,
Absolutely.
no matter what the injury is. Yeah, and that's a legitimate, like, okay, yeah, they're acknowledging that.
But isn't it more clear text to say, if somebody gets hurt in here, we will be using aviation assets to get them out?
Absolutely. Like, we might as well plan on it. And again, the better to have those conversations beforehand. and help it guide whether or not you are going to go in there. But this whole confusion about, there was some quotes in there about, is there presumptions now that um, you have to be like a red condition before we'll even consider asking for a helicopter? You know what I mean? And then it's potential. The potential there is you end up taking on more risk with this crazy pack out. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is the medical incident report is tied to patient condition and not mode of transport.
that top part, yeah, the ones with the colors,
Yeah.
the severity of emergency, transport priority. It says transport priority, not transport method.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what that segment is called there. And so, yeah, it's just one of those things. Like get with the folks that you're on fires with, and make sure you're all on the same page here. And be able to explain it to somebody else, because it's possible that somebody else is going to be filling this out for you, or your crew member.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is just another one of those things where that we can tighten up. I mean, and we're not making this stuff up. It comes from actual incidents.
Yeah.
Right. And you can get to them in that review summary.
Well, it's even interesting, as we've been talking with groups, about what the 2023 lessons, when we bring that up, people are like, really? It's not about the mode of transportation? That doesn't factor in? So I think it sort of has morphed into that, and we need to course correct that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, just pull your IRPG out and look at it and read it as if it's the first time you're reading it, and really look at what it has there. And then if you have this in your mind, you'll be able to have a pretty robust conversation about it.
Yeah. What else jumps out from last year?
Talking about engines in IA, we had this one where they ended up tangled up in some power lines that were down. And there's some real specific stuff. If your vehicle gets tangled up in some power lines, like some ways to get out of the vehicle, and scenarios where you stay in the vehicle, and scenarios where you hop out, right? So I would say go look at that that report, the Noonan Fire power line incident, and the lesson is know the basics about power line contact. And like if you've got power lines draped across your vehicle, drive away if you can. Like that's a lesson right there, and if your vehicle's not operational, remain in the vehicle until advised by utility personnel. There's some real specific protocols, and you want to go and look at those things and think about that stuff. And then if you have to leave the vehicle for some reason, like fire's coming or whatever, you want to try and get out without touching the car and the ground at the same time. That's that hopping out scenario that I talked about. And there's way more detail in that report. But I just thought it was one where it's like, man, those are really good lessons to have heard and thought about. Because
in case.
Just in case you end up in that scenario, be good to know that it's not just, let me just open the truck door and step out.
Yeah.
Parking in the black, we had another instance where a transport parked in some black, and the rig caught fire. And so some real specific lessons there about checking that parking space. And this is a type of incident that we see periodically as well. And it's always good to have that reminder, because man, it is not enjoyable to have your rig burned up because of where it was parked. So, and some people have a checklist for parking in the black, a complete walk around and checking to see that no stobs got caught in the, in the tires and are now up, have rolled around and stuff like it's just, it's like a walk around before you start up. You need to walk around when you park in the black.
And it's surprisingly, it occurs more often than it seems like it would, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
We made a whole video about it because we had a year where we had enough instances where it's just like, hey, this is a real thing.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, again, that whole thing with fuel, sometimes it's complicated because, there's some sort of fuel, saw mix or drip mix or something that's spilled in the bed or out of the compartment. Sometimes it's like that stuff's dripping out of the compartments. We've had that happen before. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
All right. Here's that one that we mentioned earlier about the UTV. So we've got them stacked right next to each other. So the first one is the UTV getting nailed by the tree in the dark. And their lesson from that was like, hey, is stock lighting enough for these UTVs? Should we consider making them more visible at night, especially when they're going to be used in this instance, like as the scouting element for the dozer or the heavy equipment? Yeah, you want to see where that UTV is going. And in smoke and dust, it just gets hard to see. And then the next one is an RLS. And I always like when we get RLSs that are not like a bad thing happened. It's just somebody going, hey, here's a cool thing that we discovered. And somebody sent one in about these magnetic safety lights.
I think that is such a great RLS. I really, really like it. I think it's called magnetic safety light. Is that what it's called?
Yep. Yes.
So if somebody goes to the IRDB, they can look it up. And, we hear sometimes people say, well, why do we only do reports when bad stuff happens? We don't. And this is a great example. And it's a great example of somebody out there who thought to themselves, man, this is something other people should know about, and took the time to write this great RLS.
Yeah, and there's multiple lessons. It's not just, hey, this magnetic safety light is super handy. It's also one of those ones that reinforces, like, be nice, because the story in the RLS is like they're out burning or on a fire and they see somebody else has this and they say, wow, that looks really useful, and they go up to them and ask them, and they said, oh yeah, and they had this conversation, and the crew soup told the other crew supervisor, this is what they are, showed them how it worked and showed them where they got them, and it was real-time lesson exchange there in the field. And then this person brought it to the next level of sending it to us so we could send it to thousands of people. Like that's how the system works.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great little write-up.
For sure. And it's super simple, man. I got one of them based on this, and it's just like it sounds. It's like a strobe that has a strong magnet on it, and you stick it on stuff and you can see it for miles. And strobes have been a thing that we've been talking about for years now, because we've had several instances where helicopter pilots have said, man, without the strobe, I never would have found them.
Yeah.
And in instances where it was really crucial to find them because they got them out from in front of a fire that was going to take them over. So yeah, big deal. And then, another UTV instance on there just about, the benefits of buckling up and putting on those DOT helmets. Somebody rolled a UTV and they were buckled in and had those helmets and felt like those really helped, as it makes sense, as they would. And then part of what complicated or helped initiate the rollover was some tie down straps broke in the back. And so another plug for inspections. Look at that stuff. How old are your tie down straps? Those things get weathered if they just sit out there all winter.
Yeah. This one, I mean, it always jumps out to me because I think about how much of a pain it is if you're in and out and in and out and in and out of a, UTV, like just taking the time to put the correct helmet on, to buckle up, all those things. This is an easy, at least in the way that I operate, right? It's an easy spot to say, I'm fine. I'm not going very far. But boy, when you read these reports and consider what the consequences could be, it definitely makes you think.
Yeah, and it's not us saying it. It's the people that were in the UTV when it rolled over, and they're the
Exactly.
ones that are saying, like, um, both. It says both firefighters credited the seatbelts in preventing injury. They're the ones that were in it when it went over, and they're the ones saying, "Man, glad I had, the DOT helmet on and wearing a seatbelt." So that's just another thing that I try to reiterate is we're just sharing the lessons that other people that went through it are telling us.
Well, and I think it's always good to put a plug in for that. Like, we appreciate it. There's, all of the reports we get, or the, learning reviews or whatever that we get, are because people are taking the time, and, all the RLSs anyway, people are taking the time to write it down and share it. And it's so great to have this kind of learning taking place. And we just appreciate every person out there that did some kind of work to share lessons this year.
Absolutely. Yeah, we couldn't do it without them.
Yeah.
And we're unique. We're a unique culture. I mean, we've had inquiries from like oil rig companies and law enforcement agencies and all these places. That they're looking at us going, how do you get that information? How is it that you have people report this stuff?
Yeah.
Right. And it's been a real intentional push for a long time for us to move towards this learning organization. And and we happen to have a group of people that were dedicated to it, and we're seeing the fruits of it now, where people think it's normal to just go, oh, I had this thing that other people might benefit from. Let me fill out this one pager. Like, that's just part of our culture now, which is crazy when looking at it from the outside. And sometimes I think we forget about that.
Yeah. And thinking how much we've grown, right? How
Yeah.
much we've evolved over time since the conscious effort to try and be a learning organization was started. It's, we had over 140 different reports submitted this year. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
That's a lot of
absolutely.
lessons. I think it's worth noting here too. I mean, you've alluded to it, but our Two More Chains that came out recently, that's full of lessons as well. We're trying to package them. Doing this episode of the podcast, we're trying to package them in a way that's consumable. Because if we have the lessons, but they're not getting to the learners, then we're not doing our job. So there's lots of ways for folks to get those lessons. Visit our website, lessons.wildfire.gov. Do some digging.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like you said, that's our job. We try and make them accessible to folks, and that's part of what this podcast is. And so, yeah, that last page, I think it's worth people looking at the graph that has the last 15 years of UTV involved incidents, and the 2023 line just goes boom. It's a huge increase. And so, just kind of going back to how we started off that conversation about making noise about things, um, and remember to take the context with it, right? To remember how useful UTVs are, but that graph just shows that, hey, this is a piece of equipment that we need to be real intentional with. And then the other one, that by activity, just that, prescribed fire is where we use a lot of UTVs. So sometimes I think we get in the habit of thinking of prescribed fire as a planned event, and thus, um, thinking that, like, there's less risk. And maybe in some cases that's true, but operating a UTV is operating a UTV, and sometimes with prescribed fire, we're in places that we wouldn't normally be in relation to fire. So just more things to keep in mind. And that, remember that last page on the incident review summary, we pick a different thing every year to look at a bigger data set rather than just the past year. And this year for obvious reasons, we looked at UTV stuff.
Yeah, I think that was pretty revealing for folks. And as you say, applying some context and considering all the benefits that aren't captured there is pretty important. So yeah, great topic to choose though.
Yeah. So
yeah,
that's the summary. And the stuff in Two More Chains, like you mentioned, is there's some other stuff in there in addition to some of the things that we covered here. If people have feedback or other insights, I know I've gotten some people emailing me going, "Hey, what about this? Have you thought of this?" And I had a UTV incident. We had after we published that pump injury that we were talking about earlier. Remember, we had somebody say, "Hey, I had a similar instance like from a long time ago," and he wrote a whole blog post for us, recounting a similar event. So, man, we welcome that stuff.
Absolutely.
Again, that's the source, is the people out there doing it.
Yep. And I just want to give a little shout out to, the Two More Chains, one of our own. We have because that whole issue, our latest issue, focuses on lessons. But we also did a great interview with Liz Skelly, who's the acting captain of U.S. Forest Service Southern Area Women's Training Crew. And she's one of those people that was just great to talk to because she loves what she does. And she right now is the captain of this women's training crew that's formed through a partnership with the Student Conservation Association. And Liz was a great person to interview. And I felt pretty inspired at the end of it, so people should check out that latest Two More Chains as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Really good stuff in there. Just like real solid insights on several different things. But I'm excited about this issue.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited about, sharing the good lessons. I appreciate you making time today to talk to me and get some of this out here in the audio format, which a lot of our audience really enjoys.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool.
All right.
Well, until next time, or until tomorrow's staff call.
Right on.
All right. Well, take it easy, Travis.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks to Travis for today's conversation and for being a champion of sharing the lessons. All the work he does at the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center is grounded in the lessons we gather each year. Thanks again to everyone who took the time in 2023 to share their lessons. Our learning environment depends on people sharing their stories. Talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wildfire Lessons podcast. Be sure to subscribe, share, give us a review. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Wildfire Lessons. Music provided by second-generation smoke jumper Steve Baker, who always likes to keep one foot in the black. Thanks, Steve. Remember, we honor through learning.